Thanks, everybody. Sorry about that. Like Lindsay said, I'm excited to get to talk to all of you this morning about the new high-frequency checks. I know that we talked a little bit about this at the last research manager call, and we sort of had talked about the fact that we were going to do this at the last quarterly data management call. So this has been the summation of a lot of work on a lot of people's parts. So I'm pretty excited to show it to you. So basically what we're going to do this morning, I'm just going to do a brief background for those of you who weren't on either of those other two calls really quickly, just giving you a sense of what our aims were in this redevelopment of the high-frequency check tool. Then I'll spend more time going over some of the new features. First, just talking and showing some of them. And then afterwards, we'll do a full demo, so you'll see how it works in practice, how it looks like when you set it up and run it. And then I'll talk a little bit about some of the things that we're continuing to work on, and now that there's a team of people who are sort of doing this, that hopefully some of this work will get carried forward, and what sort of things you can look forward to perhaps in the future. And then last, I'll give you a brief spiel about how you'll be able to install them and exactly when you'll be able to install them. Okay, so this development of the high-frequency check tool started in July during the technical retreat. Well, I guess it really started before that. A lot of the ideas for things that could be improved or could be changed in the high-frequency checks date back to both the data summit that we had previously and just lots of conversations that we've had as the Guards team with country office staff and our own experience in doing direct support and identifying different gaps that exist. But specifically, we did host a technical retreat at the end of July where we had we invited some strong data coders to come, and some people who had really been instrumental in the development and success of the earlier versions of the tool to come to New York. And we had several days where we sat down and tried to rethink some of our underlying assumptions about how high-frequency checks work and how we could improve them, and to sort of reiterate what sort of things we had seen that were going right and what sort of things that we had seen that were going wrong. And that sort of, all of that ended up informing this release. So we also, a lot of the ideas that came to fruition started there. But yeah, so basically, the biggest points that we were trying to accomplish in this version of the high-frequency checks was to make everything easier on the user to read, easier to set up, and just in general flow a little better. So we did add a couple of new features, but a lot of the bigger items were really about streamlining the entire high-frequency check process and then integrating it with the rest of your data flow better. And so hopefully that'll come across in the next few slides. So the first thing that's different about this new version of the high-frequency checks is that there is a new automated setup command. So basically, now, in the past, you could use IPA check new, and it would download a fresh copy of the master do file and your HFC inputs file and an enumerator file. Well, in this version, we've really expanded that command to both create a standardized folder structure for you for a project, and then put everything in the right place. So in the past, this command just sort of pulled in a couple of files and just put them in whatever directory you were currently in. This version tries to be much more nuanced in creating your entire folder structure and then putting all the appropriate pieces in the right place. And then it also tries to recognize that most of the data collection activities that people do don't involve just one survey, that they actually involve multiple surveys. And so this tries to facilitate easier setup of not only just the high frequency checks for one survey, but the high frequency checks for a full project that includes multiple surveys. So as you'll see here in the bottom left, this is sort of the folder structure that it's going to set up, and I'll show you an example of that during the demo. But basically, it's going to pull in several files for your templates, for your inputs, and for your replacements, and it'll automatically put them in the right place, like in this check folder under the inputs. And then here, if you see, if we had two forms, like an adult and a household form, it automatically sets up the adult form and the household form in the appropriate place and has like a naming scheme for both of them. And then in the do files, it pulls in the master check files and creates copies for both of them. And then each of the different folders has, we've also in our effort to better explain the high frequency checks as they exist, each of the folders also has a README file that explains what should go in this folder and what the purpose of this folder is. So hopefully that helps you make better use of this standardized folder structure. And then the next thing is we redesigned the input file. So now there's a new setup sheet with expanded options. There's easier to use toggles that allow you to turn checks on and off. So meaning that in the past, you sort of had to set up all the checks and then run them. And if you left any of them blank, you would get errors. And then we told people that if they wanted to turn them off, they should go into the do file and comment that section out. Well, we've tried to make that easier by now in the actual Excel file, there are toggles that you can switch on and switch off for each of the different high frequency checks. And then based on those, it should run through the do file without any problems. So like if you've turned off the duplicates check or something like that, it should bypass that check now, and you won't have to fill out the inputs before running. And then we've also tried to be better about anything that's a default to automatically to just have it at default filled. So to try and reduce the amount of time that it takes to set up the input sheet, to fill out the input sheet, we've tried to streamline places where we could have a default option to now when you pull in a fresh copy of the inputs, that default option is specified. And then also we've worked on expanding the help sections in the input file. So being more explicit about what, especially in the setup sheet, what each of the options corresponds to, what it expects that you're going to input, and that sort of thing. And so here is a screenshot that I gather is a bit small, but I'll show you a bigger version in a bit. But this is just to give you a general sense of what the new input file looks like. So here you'll see there's a bunch more options, but some of these are filled out by default. So all these ones that you see here that are filled out are pretty much defaults. You can also see there's several of these are now drop down. So instead of just letting you enter a value where it expects like a very certain either option, it's now converted to a drop down. So it's less error prone in you typing the wrong thing or having a typo or something like that. You just either turn it on or turn it off or select between three options or something like that. And then at the bottom, you can see the section that I was talking about in terms of toggling. So here, if you click the different check marks for the different sections, when you run your high frequency checks, it will just run those checks. So this gives you a way to turn on and turn off different sections of your high-frequency checks. The next big feature is new output file formatting. So here we really tried to make the outputs easier to read by using a lot of the new Excel formatting features that Stata 14 and Stata 15 provide. So that means we've taken pains to try and group the outputs better, and then add formatting to highlight which parts of the outputs are important and which parts are repeated or are less important, and to make the whole file a bit easier to read. And then we've also split off the tracking information from the regular outputs. And I'll talk a little bit more about what's in the tracking in a second, but we've also made that split to try and make things clearer that the outputs are just lists of errors. The tracking is where you're keeping track of your progress towards your recruitment goals and towards your interview goals. And then you still have the classic enumerator files and the research files. So here's an example of the output formatting. So this is for the specified check. And what you can see here is that we've grouped things by the same variable. So this first section has all of the different specify options that were for this variable language other. But you'll see we've grayed out sections that are just repeated so that it visually makes it easier for you to group things and understand what's important and what's not. And so if it's a bunch of repeated things, it's less important here. Whereas what's important are the differences in the child and parent values at the end. And so those are highlighted. And everything is grouped a little better. And the column widths also now automatically resize based on the content. So you spend less time too, opening your output file and trying to resize everything so that you can see it. That's all done in Stata now. So hopefully it'll get you going a bit faster towards actually addressing some of the issues that are coming from your high frequency checks rather than spending a lot of time reformatting them or trying to read them.
Hey, Chris, we got a request that you go into presentation mode or just make the presentation bigger.
Sure. The one thing is that in the past that has meant that I lose it. So I'll try.
Okay. I do recommend that everyone just make sure that you've gone full screen on your browser, made the Join Me app full screen. I can still see your screen.
Okay. Cool. No problem. Thanks for the comment.
Thanks.
And then one other aside is that we also worked with Survey CTO to finally get the links that had sort of been there previously to work appropriately. Last time there was a security issue where if you clicked on the link, it would take you to a login page, but then wouldn't actually take you, then you would log in, but it wouldn't take you to the actual submission that it corresponds to, which was like a security feature in Excel that we had to work with Survey CTO to get a workaround for. But we've been able to do that. So now for each of these outputs as well, to better integrate with Survey CTO, there is a link for each of them as well, where you can click it and it will open up in Survey CTO that submission in their monitoring tab, and you'll be able to review that full submission if you'd like, in that nice format that Survey CTO has that looks like a paper form. So if you want to review this entire submission, you can click the link and it'll take you there. And then for the new tracking output file, this, like I said, is meant to sort of split off the two purposes that had been served before by the one output file. So we have the tracking outputs, and then the regular, it's just the logical errors outputs. And so also what we've done in this version is we've integrated the prog report command that Rosemary's been working on, so that you get a nicer formatted tracking information, and the ability to create progress report sheets, so that both tell you like how close you are to different recruitment targets in different areas, and gives you lists of who still remains and who's been completed, so that you can follow up with your field team. And so this is an example of what that looks like. So this is for a rather large project that had 40 different communities that they were working in. And so you'll see in the summary page for the tracking sheet, you'll get that output from prog report, where you get per whatever your filter variable is, in this case it's a ward, you'll get totals of interviewed versus how many were expected, what percentage you're at in relation to your target, and then when the first submission and when the last submission in that area was. And so these are all automatically sorted by completion rate, and you get you can set at what your target is. So like if you want to get to at least less than 10% attrition in each of the different wards, you could set your target rate to 90%, and then these will switch to green whenever you get to 90% in each of these different communities. And then, of course, also you have the ability to output for each of these communities what's the list of people. So, for instance, here in Roma, what are the 16 individuals who have been surveyed, and what are the 44 individuals who have not? So, yeah, that's the tracking. Then for the numerator dashboard, we included new indicators of performance, and a big advantage is that now the creation of the Excel file is completely done within Stata, so you don't have to download a copy of the template for the enumerator file in order to get the column headers. That all is created from within Stata. And then we also added a other column, so that in addition to in the past, you could see rates of refusals or don't knows, or general counts and durations by enumerator. Well, we added one more column to include the rates of them selecting others, like a specify other value, so that you can see if there are differences by enumerator. And then we added a full extra sheet that also outputs variable summary statistics by enumerator, so that you can also look at, like, are there differences in by enumerator in reporting of certain questions, and the means and standard deviations and mins and maxes by enumerator. And then all of it, we've tried to make it match the sort of output formatting from the other outputs as well. So we've added lines and bolded text and things like that to make the whole thing easier to read, and hopefully easier to understand. And then next, we also added a new replacements workflow that makes the replacements easier to set up and use. So we're using Excel macros to create the different replacement sheets. Now there are several different actions that you can do from within the replacements file. So you're able to drop an observation from a data set. So say that you have duplicates and you need to resolve some of the duplicates, and you find out that one of them was an incomplete submission. You went back and you found the person and completed the full survey, so you need to drop the incomplete submission. You can do that from the replacement workflow now. So you would just specify that the ID for that survey that you'd like to drop, and then when you run the checks, it'll drop that, and that won't be considered in the checks and the tracking and the output. Another one that right now works just for constraints and outliers, but we did allow for you to to mark a value as okay. So if you run your high frequency checks the first time and you've found an outlying value for income or something like that, somebody who reported a really high income, and you go back and you check and you verify that that is the correct value, they just actually are an outlier. It wasn't a mistake. You can now in the replacements workflow, you can mark that value as okay, and then the high frequency checks won't flag it anymore. So you won't continue to get that coming up in your output. And then the last option is the one that's existed forever, to just the ability to make actual replacements to replace particular values with new values. This also got shined up, and the replacements file also looks a lot better and cleaner. And so here's an example of the replacements workflow, like I talked about with the 3 different actions highlighted. And so these colors automatically pop up when you select the different actions. When you add new rows to the replacement sheet, these lines automatically come on so that you can distinguish between completed rows and incompleted rows and that sort of thing. And then you also have which had been an issue in the past, you have a tab that helps you create new sheets within this replacements workbook, and that will automatically get the column headers right so that the do files will read them properly. Next, there's also now the high frequency checks are fully integrated with BC Stats, meaning that you can do the setup of BC Stats directly from the inputs sheet. So there's now an additional tab where you can set up your back-check variables, so which ones you want to be back-checked, which type they are, whether or not you want to use a t-test or do a reliability test, or whether or not you want to allow a certain range to be okay within each of those. All of that you can specify from within the input sheet, and the BC Stats is now added to the master check file as well, so you can run everything from one centralized do file and one workflow. And if you had a particular way that you really liked to run BC Stats in the past, like I mentioned in the setup sheet, there is the ability to turn things on and off now. So if you had a way that you really liked to do in the past and you don't want to go with the way that it is in the new high frequency checks, you can still do that. You can just turn off this ability. But hopefully this makes things a bit easier to set up for people in the crunch time before the launch of the survey. So here's what the input sheet sort of looks like for BC Stats. Like I said, you can now directly in the input sheet specify the variables that you want to back check between survey and your back check survey, with specifying which type you want them to be, what the allowable ranges are, and whether or not you want to perform a t-test. So yeah, that's BC Stats. There's also a new workflow for resolving duplicates. And this relates specifically to duplicates of survey IDs. And in the past, it had been the case that these were often sources of errors in tracking, because tracking sort of expects that there's no duplicates in the data set and that you're merging one-to-one between whatever your list of people that you wanted to find are and the list of people that you actually interviewed are, and that they would have a one-to-one correspondence. So now, prior to that, there's a command that identifies any survey duplicates and beyond that, tries to help you identify whether or not they're exact duplicates or partial duplicates by running, essentially running a comparison between the duplicates and figuring out whether or not they are exactly match on every value, and if they don't match on every value exactly, how many values do they not match on, and then also outputting those discrepancies between the two so that you can hopefully resolve duplicates easier. And this also incorporates smart formatting like the others to make the whole thing easier to read. So here's sort of an example of a duplicate in the duplicate workflow. So this survey 1201 appeared in twice in our data set. And you'll see now in the first sheet of the duplicates output, you would get how many duplicates there are. So here there are 2. And then this comparison between them. So they were compared on 40 values. That's basically how many things have been filled out in the survey. And we found 15 differences between the 2. So they're not exact duplicates. So we might want to look at whether or not somebody entered the wrong ID or what exactly is going on there. And so it also will export which variables it's different on in the other tab, so that you can look further into that and try and figure out and resolve those. Okay, so that's an overview, and then I'm going to do a demo, but I wanted to stop for a second. And I think there were potential questions that had cropped up while I was talking, so I'll give a second for those.
Yeah, we got, does this require Stata 15, and when should you use this as opposed to the Survey CTO monitoring dashboard?
Great question. And so basically for the first one, for Stata 15, I think we can get back to you for 100% sure. I think it only requires Stata 14. I think that's what we've been aiming for. So not Stata 15. But definitely it will not work with Stata 13 because Stata 13 just doesn't allow you to do all of this nice formatting that we've done. And so it will have to be at least Stata 14. And we'll confirm that when we announce the full release, and we'll tell you exactly which version of Stata that you should have. Because there are subtle differences between Stata 14 and 14.1 and 14.2, and then there's 15. So we'll just make sure of that before we tell everybody. And then as far as integrating with the monitoring tab, there are still things that you can do in this workflow that you cannot do in the Survey CTO monitoring tab, mainly like doing actual back checks. Is still, I can't think of an easy way to get really nice summary statistics and error rates from the Survey CTO tab. Also, like the whole tracking workflow is much more difficult in the monitoring tab. You can get now in the monitoring tab lists of issues like you can do in our own high-frequency check template. I tend to think ours is still a bit more flexible and a bit more thought through in exactly what types of checks you should be setting up and that sort of thing. But that being said, you can, some of these like identifying of outliers, constraint violations, things like that, you could set up within the survey monitoring tab in Survey CTO. But at this point, there's just not as many resources in terms of getting you started quicker in the monitoring tab. But and we've tried to make it so that you could use both if you wanted to by adding this submission link between the two, so that now when you run the high frequency checks, you get a link to the monitoring tab so that you can go there, and so hopefully in the future it'll continue to get more seamless to transition between the two. But it's something we're always interested in. And if you have thoughts about other things that we could do within the monitoring tab to make it easier. We're always willing to hear those as well. Anything else?
With apologies for missing it, but a status update on the autofill of the input sheet.
So we have a version of that that Ishmael has been working on that I'm sure that you could talk to him about if you want to use it. Basically, we didn't include it at this yet because we just weren't 100% sure yet that it worked in every case. But if you're okay with using something that's still at might have some kinks to work out, then we can definitely put you in contact with him, and you can do that as well. We have tried to make it slightly easier by the things that are just for every survey should be filled out a certain way, or are very rare that you would want to use a different option. We've tried to make those defaults there for all inputs to make it a bit easier, but I do understand it does still take time to set these up, and we are still working on developing the autofill. Okay, so cognizant of time, I think I am going to try and do the demo, and if you have any additional questions, maybe there may be a bit of time at the end, but I'm also happy if you want to email the team or ask any of the additional members of the team later. That would also be great. Okay. So let me grab this. Okay, so let's say that, let me start with the IPA check setup. So let's say that I already have one project here. Let's say QDMC. Let's say I want to start a new project in this QDMC folder. So I'm in Stata. So I go to the QDMC folder. And then I run IPA check new, and I'm gonna have two surveys, household and adult. Surveys, not survey. So here, what it's doing is pulling in, like I said, it's automatically setting up. So I created that QDMC folder. It's now automatically created all of the file structure, so all the folders that we need with the READMEs in them. So you can always open these and figure out what this folder is supposed to be for and what you're supposed to be using it for. And then it's automatically populated here in the do file, two different versions of the master check file, one for the adult survey, one for the household survey. In the checks, it also set up two different input sheets, one for each of them, and replacement files, one for each of them. And then I believe, yeah, that's all that it pulls in to set up. And then in this project structure, then to actually run a project. So here's a version where I've already filled out the input sheet. So basically the only real difference between this one and the other one, sorry, it came up on my other screen. So here's the input sheet. And the only other real difference between this one and the one I just created is that I've added some data. So here I added, basically downloaded some survey data, imported its data, and then I have both my master data set and a sample data set that I use both for tracking and for running BC stats, just to make this example a bit simpler, but they're both here. So here are my two data. I've just added my two data sets, and then in my input sheet, I've taken the pain to fill them out. So this is the setup sheet. You'll see there's a bunch more options now, but there are also, some of these are filled out by default, and then also there's better explanations of what each of these are and what you should be putting in each of these cases. So here in the data set, I've linked to my survey data set, and then I'm using both for the tracking and for my back check this sample data set that just contains the full set of interviews with a few discrepancies so that I get some errors in my back checks. Then it links to both the inputs and the replacements file. Here's where I'm specifying all the output files that it's going to create and where they're going to go in this project structure. And then identifying what my survey ID is, what my enumerator ID, some of these were there in the past. I can specify what are the missing value codes that I use that I can then convert to Stata missing values. The options for progress report are all here. So both the total number of surveys planned, the target completion rate, how I want things stratified, what variables I want to keep in my tracking sheets that come out of it. Some options around the enumerator outputs, all of that sort of thing, the back checks. And then here's the section I was talking about turning things on and off. So if I want to run, I don't want to run the progress report, I can turn that off. If I want to run it, I can turn it on. So basically this should be all set up. If I save it, and then let me go back to this project. And then I believe, yeah. Here's the master check file that I have set up. And then if I run it, so you remember from the inputs, what I have on and off. I have the duplicates off, the follow-up off, these new commands that I didn't have the time to mention but are in the slides, off, and other stuff. So you'll see it's run through all of the high frequency checks, and now it's actually running the back checks as well. So you'll see that's all seamlessly done from the same do file, and then it's created some outputs already. So in the tracking, these are all from progress report. So basically, here's my progress report. It compared that sample and my survey data. It says these are the ones that have been submitted versus the full sample. This is what the rates are. And then it outputted, I specified the option in the inputs. There's this option to export lists as separate workbooks instead of separate tabs. So because there were so many wards in this case, I exported them as separate files rather than tabs within the tracking file. So you have the option for all of these. These are basically tracking sheets by ward. And so these have different IDs for people, and it automatically sorts which ones have been submitted and which ones haven't. And you'll see the submission dates, and you can add additional variables here to show additional things for all of these people. And then, yeah, which ones have been submitted and which ones have not been submitted. And then, so that's tracking the duplicate sheet that I talked about. Here you go. So here's the exact duplicate, but this time there are no differences between the two. If you look, here's where they would list any other variables where there had been differences between the two duplicates, but in this case there weren't any, so they aren't listed. But if there were some, they would get listed there. And then so that's the tracking output for the HRC output. We still have the version control check here in the outputs, and then the normal checks. So there weren't any incomplete. You remember we turned off duplicates, so the duplicates tab isn't created here because we have turned that one off. There's no issues there. The standard issues in some of the other places. So these are the different constraint violations. Everything is automatically sized. Here at this link will not go to an actual submission because this is not an actual database, but if you were running it on an actual project and had properly specified in the inputs your server name and whatnot, this should go directly to that submission. And then in the enumerator file, we have the traditional summary plus this other, the rates of other by enumerator. And then there's an additional stats tab that has, so here we were looking at gender, consent, and child number, the mean, standard deviations, mins, and maxes by enumerator. So we can look through for enumerators who have significant different results from others to try and identify where issues might lie. And so that is also controlled from the input sheet in the enumerator tab. So here there's an additional stats variable column where it's getting those, so I could add an additional one if I wanted to subtract them. And then for the replacements, you'll see this is, we already, in that sequence, I already had one replacement getting made. And so you'll also get a log file now of the replacements that have been made and whether or not they've been successful. So here's, if I show you, this was the original replacements file. This is the log file saying that for that particular ID, the replacement was successful. This would also flag any areas where it wasn't able to make a replacement for some reason. And so that's the log. If I go to my output and I want to fix an additional one, I should be able to. So like, let's say that this 17 was actually an 18, so I can copy this section. To my replacement tab, off by 1. And I want to replace the value 17 with 18. I want to make a replacement. I could say that for my own note-keeping purposes, I could say wrong value specified. And save it. Close by open windows and then rerun the output file. You should see 1 in the log. Now we have 2. We do have an issue with this one. We have to look at, but yeah. So that's how the replacement workflow works. If I I, for instance, now decide that I want to run it again, but I don't want to run the logic checks and the all missing checks, I can come in here and save the inputs again, and then just rerun. And now it should skip those sections, so it won't run those anymore. So yeah, I think that's a quick overview. Hopefully we'll continue to provide additional things in the coming weeks. Sorry, I wasn't paying attention. Were there additional questions at this point?
Yeah, we got Ghana and Kenya both gently suggesting that email alerts be added. And then Mari asked, regarding enumerator performance by question, flagging enumerators with large differences will have to be done manually, correct?
So right now for the means, it doesn't highlight them, but for the other tabs, like the ones where there's a large difference in specifying don't know or refusal or things like that, those are highlighted in pink. The ones that are like in the top, I think it's top 10th percentile away from the mean or something like that. I have to verify exactly what the decision criteria there was, but they do it is meant to highlight the outlying values. And if it's the case that people would particularly like that to be a feature of the stats form, we can add that as well.
And the email were about the tracking sheets in particular.
So the email, we could definitely put that up. We just have to do it in a way that is security aware. And I think that there was a workflow that we worked on back at the Data Summit using this PS email command that runs in Stata. So we could at least in the very intermediate periods point you to how you would adjust the do files to basically read, because already it takes a survey CPO username. So if that's the same as the email that you want, you have that available and you could email it. But yeah, we can, if that's something that everybody would like and we can do it in a secure fashion, I don't think it's that hard to add on to this.
That was all the questions that came in.
Okay, then in the last just few seconds, I wanted to talk about the other things that I had in terms of next steps, and then to just highlight the, sorry, go back. So one of the things that we've been working on as well that we have a version of that is creating a more interactive master run do file, so that basically like you run it and it asks you whether or not you want to import things, whether or not you want to download the data, that sort of expands the capabilities of the existing master check file. So that's something to look forward to, and if you have thoughts about, we'd love to hear. And part of that is also integrating the automated downloading. So I did in the process of this, I wrote a command to download data. So if you've used, there's some code floating around that I had made in the past of a template do file for doing this. Well, I wrapped all of that and added some additional features into just a simple state command that will download data using the API in either long or wide format that I can make available after this. And then the one place where we still haven't improved the output formatting yet is the research dashboard. So that's still something we'd like to work on. And then as somebody rightly asked, we are still hoping to work on the autofilling to make it easier for things to set up. And then the last thing I really wanted to take a second to recognize the people that have helped work on this. They've been a great team in getting all of this together. It's become a much bigger project than it was in the past, and I'm really appreciative of all of them for all their effort, and I hope that also they'll be able to take on some of this as I now transition off and on to other things. And I hope that one of the nice things in this process is that I feel confident that IPA as a whole will be able to continue to develop and continue to improve on the high frequency checks after I'm gone, and that the whole organization now, I would encourage everyone to not think of it as ever a set project, but always a process of improvement. And there are always things that we should and can and could do better. And there are people around who can help do that.
Okay, we got one command and one question. The command is that you cannot leave, and the question is, can the API do encrypted survey CTO forms?
No, because that's just a limitation of the API. Like we don't have the ability to decrypt the data because Survey CTO doesn't make the keys available to decrypt it from the API.
Great. Okay, great. Thank you so much, Chris. This is great. And we'll definitely have next steps for people, whether it's helping us potentially test out things like the autofill tool if you're interested in that, or